I'm really excited to be here with you guys. I've never been to Barcelona before, I've never been to Spain before, but I speak some Spanish, so I was really excited to come and try it out. I've had some good experiences and bad experiences trying to speak Spanish, so for what it's worth. So quick introduction here. My name is Zack Argyle. I've been at Pinterest for the last 4 years, and before that I worked for PlayStation. I've got a wonderful family, a wife and a son who's 3.5, and a daughter on the way in December, which I'm really excited about. One thing that you should know about me is that I do find great joy in little things. I don't know why that brought me so much joy when I did that animation, but I was like laughing to myself in my room. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is, that went way too far. So what we're going to talk about today is progressive web apps. And we're going to talk about a lot of different things regarding that, but in particular, we're going to go through 3 steps. So first, this whole talk is kind of a case study of Pinterest's progressive web app. It's been talked about in a couple different blog posts and a couple different talks in Chrome Dev Summit last year. But I'm going to talk about some very specific things, kind of real-world use cases of progressive web apps. And so this is going to talk about PWAs, but then also Pinterest's use of it. So we'll start off with a story. And this is where I tell the guys to cue it up. They know what that means. Dramatic lighting, that's what that means. Fue una noche oscura al principio de 2015. El sitio móvil de Pinterest había sido descuidado y dejado para pudrirse en las calles de San Francisco. Nos llegamos a una bifurcación en el camino. Invertimos más en el sitio móvil, obligamos a los usuarios a descargar la aplicación nativa, la cual es mejor según los métricos. Éramos una pequeña empresa, entonces decidimos dejar el sitio móvil para morir. Para mí fue la gota que colmó el vaso. Creamos 2 nuevas funciones. I promise I'm not going to speak Spanish the whole time. And I told you it was going to be ridiculous, so you were warned. Primeramente, una página de bloqueo que le pide que descargue la aplicación. Es posible que la han visto en otros sitios como Yelp. So this is like a blocking interstitial page that everyone loves. You've probably seen it on Yelp. Whoa, where did we go? Yeah. La segunda función, enlaces profundas, o sea, enlaces por los cuales si se han tocado, lo llevan a la tienda de aplicaciones, a menos que ya tenga la aplicación descargada. So when you click on anything, you go to the App Store. That's fun. Me encontré en un camino oscuro, hueco dentro. ¿Fui yo el único que se sintió de esa manera? ¡No! ¿Sabe lo que descubrí? No andaba yo solo. I was not alone. There was others who felt this way about Pinterest's old mobile web. Ooh! Ooh, it just gets worse. There's more, don't worry. Ooh, yeah, that's too real. That's too real. I got a lot of cupcakes in my feed. And the last one, my good friend Ahmed. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I actually reached out to each of them individually, and they gave me permission to use the tweets, so they were like, I don't know what you're using it for, but please do. That's great. So at the end of the day, I kind of felt like this. I was like, what are we doing? Why did we do these things that everyone hates? And then it kind of devolved into a little bit of this. But there was a very important lesson that I learned as we went through this. And that is that metrics do not measure sentiment. So there's a big Big thing in the industry right now to be very data-driven in all of the decisions that you make, right? You want to change the text on a button, you're going to run some experiment to see how your users react to the different text on the button. But sentiment cost is something that's not really reflected inside of those metrics. So for example, and specifically if we're talking about Pinterest, if I were to click on a link to Pinterest from Google, right? I'm in like Google search results, and I see a link, and I click on it, and then I get that blocking page that doesn't let me do anything unless I download the app. Sure, some people will click it, and like that increases my app installs, but that also means that the next time someone sees a Pinterest link, they're not going to click on it. And that doesn't get reflected in your metrics. So there's a cost to sentiment that you have to be aware of. So that's something I think was really, really important. And so once we got to the point where we realized that mobile web needed to be improved upon, we decided that instead of doing some small changes to make it a little bit better, we were just going to start from scratch and make it all better. So we went all in. We hard forked our desktop web app, and we actually made it so that you were not allowed to import from any code inside the desktop code base. Not at all. If you wanted to share any code, you had to pull it out into a separate package. All right, so the next part is the 3 R's. So the 3 R's are what I think makes a good progressive web app. And then we're also going to talk about, during this, kind of what Pinterest has done related to those R's. So first, if you're not aware of what a progressive web app is, it's essentially a site that utilizes progressive enhancements. So progressive enhancements was a thing like 5 years ago or so, essentially saying that some browsers support features that other browsers do not. And so if your experience is better on the better, more modern browsers, then you have progressive enhancements, right? And that's what progressive web app came from, but that's not what it means anymore. So this is deprecated. And we really need like a new term for it, because really what it is now is a site that uses modern browser technologies and best practices to provide a fast native-like experience. Right? We want to be able to basically contend with a native app in the browser. And so we need a new term for this. So I have some suggestions for what we could do. The first is, I think, one that makes a lot of sense. We could just call it a modern web app. That's one that Google is starting to use a lot more. We could also just call it a not garbage web app, which I think is pretty fitting as well. Or an actually good web app, might be nice. Or my favorite, really only awesome and not Safari web app. We'll talk about service workers later. So moving on to the 3 R's of superb PWAs. I really wanted to do reduce, reuse, recycle, but it didn't quite work, if you're familiar with that phrase. So we got reduce, reuse, review. So we'll jump into reduce. This one I think is kind of easy to get your head around. Essentially, it's make everything smaller. Make your app lighter. So the big part here is your bundle's too big. You're sending too much JavaScript. And that is constantly a problem for every site, everywhere, and it devolves really quickly. Adi Osmani said, as we build sites that are increasingly more reliant on JavaScript, we sometimes pay for what we send down in ways that we don't always easily see. It's not something that we often think about. If we think about bytes coming over the wire, like especially on Pinterest, there's way more image bytes coming over the wire than JavaScript, right? There's tons of images, and some of them are like huge. But the cost of JavaScript far outweighs the cost of an image in browser speak, which means that you have to be especially careful of how big your JavaScript is and how much you're sending. In general, they say that you want to shoot for less than 200 kilobytes of JavaScript for an initial page load, which is actually quite hard to do. One of the most popular PWAs in the world, Twitter Lite, I don't know if you use that, is actually about 500 kilobytes right now. So it far goes outside of this. And there's actually a lot of people who are unhappy with the performance on slow networks because of that. So I mentioned one thing that Pinterest did in particular when we started out our mobile web rewrite to make sure that our bundles were going to be small. And that was, we actually wrote an ESLint plugin called Pinterest only safe imports. So safe imports really just means that I know I can import from this place, and I'm not going to get a huge jumbled mess of dependencies that's going to bloat my bundle. So if you look here, we're saying that if you're in the mobile directory, you can only import from the mobile directory or the packages directory, which is like the shared between desktop and mobile web, and the constants. And there was actually a very interesting case here for the blacklisted imports. So we're saying you actually cannot import from Lodash at all, even if you're doing like the individual files, because of the way Webpack works currently at Pinterest, where desktop and mobile web are both going through the same Webpack configuration, and anything that gets used in either of them can't get tree shaken, which means that if we import from any of the Lodash stuff in mobile web, it imports all of the stuff that desktop web is using, which is really funky. So this was really, really helpful in kind of enforcing all of the other engineers at Pinterest. We've got like 600 engineers at Pinterest now. Not all of them are web engineers, but kind of forcing them and enforcing this lightweight idea. Second thing we did was we pulled up Webpack Bundle Analyzer. If you've never used that before, you should definitely check it out. It's really cool. So this one on the left side is what it looked like when we first started out building the mobile web PWA. And so in the top left, we've got our vendor chunk, or our vendor bundle. The bottom left is the entry chunk, or entry bundle. And then all of those other ones you see on the right side, from like the middle on to the right, those are all of our route split code bundles. So we code split for every route, and that's what all of those are. And we noticed by looking at this that it was actually really interesting. Almost all of these like code split routes were using the same code and importing the same code. And so they were getting reused across almost all of the routes and getting duplicated in each of the bundles. So we said, what if we take all of our like library codes, we've got like a lib directory, what if we take all of that and stick it inside the entry chunk, and anything else that gets used in more than 3 of the other routes? What if we stick all of that stuff in the entry chunk? And we did that, and it turned out to be over on the right side, where our entry chunk increased by 20K, which isn't great, but all of our route chunks decreased by 90%. So all of them went from about 14K down to like 1 to 3K. And we currently have 70 routes, 70 route bundles at Pinterest, so that was a huge saving for our users overall. But it felt weird, because we were adding to our core bundle and making it, like 20% increase. Like that's not something that you want to do to your core bundle, but it actually turned out to be good overall, which is cool. In the end, this is where Pinterest PWA ended up. Actually updated these numbers this morning, so they are very up to date. But we're sitting right around 200K, which is really cool, and I'm very proud of that. And I think one of the interesting things here is I'm just trying to say that it's possible. So we've got like over 600 JavaScript files in the mobile web code base that are being used. There's 70 routes. There's over 250 components that are not even included inside of our core UI library that we have open sourced. So there's a lot of code going into this, and we still made it below the 200K threshold, which is awesome. A second thing to reduce, your HTML is also too big. This isn't something that we think about very often. And I loved this quote from Alex Russell. He said this just a week or two ago. He said, we need to talk about Redux and server-side rendering. So SSR, we're gonna use that a bunch. If you're not familiar with it, SSR is server-side rendering. Just saw a second large commercial site sending more than 100K of zipped HTML payload this week. So for comparison, Pinterest sends about 15K for all of it, and that actually includes all of the CSS that we will ever use on our mobile web. We inline 5K of CSS, and that's all of the CSS that Pinterest uses for mobile web. We have no external CSS resources. So really, it's more like 10K of HTML and 5K of inlined CSS. So if you're sending over 100K, that's crazy. And the question is like, how is that even possible? How are you sending that much? And what it is it's when you do server rendering, there's this idea of hydration on the client side. So the way that it works is I send a request to the server. the server says, okay, I'm going to server render, so I got to go over to the API, get some data, bring it back. I'm going to create all of my HTML payload, and then when I get to back to the browser, I don't want them to make those requests again, so I have to send all of that API data also in the HTML itself. So it starts to bloat it. And specifically with Redux, people put a lot of information inside of Redux, not just API data. And so they'll pre-populate Redux with a whole bunch of extra information and shove it all down the pipe in their HTML. So their HTML is not just HTML. It's not just script tags and link tags. It's also this big JSON blob of API data and session data, which can get really big really, really fast if you're not paying attention. So I mentioned SSR, and Pinterest actually uses more of the app shell technique. So we're going to talk about a little bit more details about that. But essentially what an app shell is a static blob of HTML that I'm going to send down for every request. So instead of doing server rendering, I'm just going to send down this template, and the browser is going to deal with the rest of it. It'll do all of the rendering on the client side. We don't do any rendering on the server. And there are pros and cons to both of these. If we think of this line here as a timeline, so seconds moving to the right, one of the interesting benefits of server rendering is that you get to see all of the content faster. Right? I've already got all of my HTML all created on the server side, and I send it back. But then as soon as I see it, I still have to wait a really long time before all of the JavaScript downloads and gets parsed and evaluated, and then I can finally interact. So those blue dots means that's where I can now interact. So server rendering takes a long time to be able to be interactive, that's the right word. But you do get to see the content very fast, which is kind of cool. The app shell is instead, this static string basically that I'm sending up, so I can send it really, really fast, and I can get something on the screen, right? That little logo, that's the Pinterest app shell. It's just this little thing. It's very fast to get up there. You see something immediately. So that first paint is really, really fast. And that starts out the downloading of all of your JavaScript, right? So we get to do that way earlier than the server render does. And then we get to interactive really fast. But then once you get to interactive, then you have to wait for all that API data to come back. Right now that all my JavaScript is loaded, now I know what I need to go get. So then there's this kind of delay before you actually get the meaningful paint, where all of the stuff is populated. So there's a little bit of a trade-off here, but in general, app shells are a lot faster. And one of the big benefits of an app shell, especially when we're talking about PWAs, is that this thing is cacheable. Right? Server-rendered stuff is not cacheable, it's not reusable, but the app shell is reusable because there's no route-specific information in it. The route-specific information gets figured out on the client side. So what I can do is I can cache this inside my service worker, and then the next time you come back to Pinterest.com, I just give it to you from the service worker, so you don't even have to go to the server, and you can get something within 100 milliseconds. I can get something up on the screen for you, which is really, really cool. Now there is one big downside to the app shell, and that is the elephant in the room. It's SEO. Server rendering is still required for good SEO, and it turns out Pinterest cares a lot about SEO. So what the heck did we do here? We all of the SEO search crawling is now being done on mobile, and we're using an app shell. So how do we do that without getting kind of hosed over by Google or by Microsoft? So what we actually do is we use AMP. So we have a whole bunch of AMP pages. I think we probably have more AMP pages than any other company in the world. We have a lot. And what we do is any traffic coming from a search engine, whether it's a bot or a user, we actually give them our AMP page. We server render our AMP pages ourselves, and we give that to the user. Because we know that that is very SEO friendly, it's server rendered, and it's all good to go. And that way, the app shell stuff doesn't even have to worry about it, which is pretty cool. Now, I said Pinterest uses an app shell, but that was a little misleading because it's actually like a pseudo app shell. We actually server render the app shell. So there's a big issue here with app shells that it doesn't really have a good answer for, and that is if I'm logged in or if I'm logged out and things should be different, whether or not I'm logged in or logged out, or some other state that should change things. I don't have any of that, right? So if I give you the app shell, now I've got to go make, right? The app shell comes back to the browser. Then I've got to go make a request to the server saying, like, is this person logged in? Like, can you give me like this person's information? So I gotta wait on that before I even render anything, and then I can render stuff. But that's like a huge blocker right there, especially on a slow connection. That can take a really long time where you're just sitting there looking at this little logo and going, what is going on? So what we actually do is we embed a bunch of information in the app shell about the user. So things like whether they're authenticated, information about the user itself, any experiments that the user is in, what their locale is, right? Like we can't render before we know what their locale is because we're not gonna like show English text and then change it to Spanish like 3 seconds later. Like that would be weird. So we have all of this information embedded in the actual HTML itself, in that app shell, which is kind of funky, especially when you think about, well, what if they like change their language and settings, or what if they log out, or any of these things? There's all of these states that could change, but now that information is cached. So what we actually do is we take that information and we stick it in local storage, and we prefer whatever is in local storage. So the app shell is really just there for like that first load, and then all of that user information will come from local storage after that. And we update local storage anytime any of those settings change, which has worked out really well. Our app shell looks something like this. We've got our scripts up at the top. We've got that inlined style tag, right? That 5K of CSS up in the top. And then we've got the JSON blob with the user information. Then we've got the actual shell, which is really just like a div with an SVG in there. And then another little script at the bottom that decides if you're in dark mode, because we need the shell to also be in dark mode. So it's kind of an interesting little thing. I loved this quote from Monika. She said, the Monika perf test, if you wouldn't make eye contact with a stranger for the time it takes your web app to first paint, it's too slow. That means, for me, most sites are very, very slow. All right, so moving on to our second R. So we talked about reduce, now we're talking about reuse. When we're talking about reusing something, the main word that comes to mind for me is caching. Right? Caching is a way of reusing something that you've already done. And we can't talk about caching without talking about service workers. So, because we've been sitting down for so long, I want everyone to stand up real quick, get out of your chairs, and don't give me that look. I saw you giving me like, I don't want to do that, man. Yeah, give it a little stretch. Feels good. Some people aren't standing up, but I won't call you out. I just did. So I want you to stay standing if you already know about service workers. If you don't know anything about service workers, take a seat. Oh, there's actually quite a bit of people who know about them. That's great. Stay standing if you have ever used a service worker. All right, now we're getting down. Now we're getting down. This is great. Stay standing if you have ever written your own service worker code, so it was not generated from a build step. Doesn't it suck? All of you that are standing, it's so bad. It's like so tedious. Okay, you can sit down. That's great. We've got some pros in the room. I like it. That's great. So for those who don't know much about service workers, just a quick understanding of what it is. It's essentially this thing that sits in between your website and your server, and it lives in the browser. And it can live kind of external to the life cycle of your site, which is really cool. So it can be alive even when someone is not on your site. What that means is that any requests going to your server will actually go through the service worker first. And there's a lot of benefits to that. The first being any kind of caching, right? So like any request I'm making for like an asset, maybe I'm going out to my CDN to go get some JavaScript or CSS. I go through the service worker first, and I can say, I want to cache that thing so that next time I can just give it to you straight from there. Now, we do have a browser cache, which does something very, very similar, but it's actually faster when you do it through the service worker because it's cached in V8's bytecode, which is really interesting. So that's kind of the main thing that people use service workers for. You can also use it for like payment requests and stuff like that, for notifications. We're not going to talk about those today, but this idea of caching is really, really important. And service workers are awesome because they're actually supported by all of the major browsers now, which is really cool. And I say that with a caveat also because the service workers in Safari still suck, and there's a lot of issues with them, especially if you're like trying to add to home screen and reuse your service workers. It just doesn't work very well. But we're getting there, and I'm very excited about that, and that they're actually doing it. So let's talk about Pinterest PWA again. What do we do in our service worker relating to caching? So one of the cool things about the service worker is that when it's registered and when it starts up, you actually have this opportunity to do some work. And you're in a separate thread, so it's not going to like block anything in your site. And you have this opportunity to go do some things. And so one of the things that a lot of people do is they go and pre-cache stuff that they think is important. So we didn't want to pre-cache everything. Like I said, we have 70 routes. We're not going to go pre-cache every single route because there's no way that you're going to go see all of those. That would be absurd. But we took what we think are the 8 most important routes, the most likely you are to go to, and we pre-cached those. We pre-cached the entry bundle and the vendor bundle. We pre-cached the app shell, and we also pre-cached the locale bundle, which is really interesting because that means that your service worker, which is a static file, has to be aware of the user's locale. So what we actually do is we have a build step that generates a service worker for every locale. And then on our web server, we have a handler that is actually, when you hit sw.js on Pinterest, it's not a static file that you're getting. You're hitting a handler which is deciding which service worker to give you, which also makes it so that we can do things like experimenting with different versions of our service worker, which is cool. And then we also do runtime caching, which is great. Make sure I'm watching time. Okay, we're doing good. So outside of the service worker caching, one piece of caching that a lot of people do as well is caching response data from the API, from the client side. Right, I make a request to my server for some information, and I want to cache it so that if someone comes back to this view, I don't want to make that request again, basically, right? So we do that as well. And one thing that we do is we actually normalize all of the data that comes back from the server. So for instance, if I go to my home feed, which is just a bunch of pins, each one of those pins has a user and a board associated with it and some information about each of those that can be displayed in the grid. So we take each of those items and we normalize it so that now the feed items are just an ID and the type. So it's like the pin ID and then the type is pin. And then we have like the big old pin object or pins object that has all of the key value pairs for the IDs and the pins themselves. And then the users get stripped out and pulled out into their own cache, and then the boards get stripped out and pulled out into their own cache. The reason I mention this is because it makes some things really, really nice. So this GIF here is showing that I actually haven't made a request specifically for that pin, but I already have information about the pin. So if I'm going to go to the details view, I might as well just reuse the information I have about the pin while I'm waiting for the details to fill in, right? And because I've normalized that response data, and I have the pin and a single source of truth for like pin data, I can reuse what I already have from the feed, and then when the details view comes back up, it can just update the pin object with all the extra information that it has, which is really, really nice. And it makes it so that we have this like instantaneous route change. Now this route change would not be instantaneous, right? Because I said that all of our route bundles are code split, so they're all separate bundles. And I haven't loaded that close-up view route yet. But we actually also have a thing built in to our code base where we can preload routes as well. So if I'm on, this example here is if I'm on that like detailed close-up view, I can actually say, I'm pretty sure that this person is going to save or repin this pin. So I want to like go ahead and like preemptively download that bundle. And so that's what this repin.preload does. It says, I want to go like preemptively go get that ready just in case I click on it. And the same thing happens from the home feed. So on the home feed, we're like, okay, we're pretty sure you're going to click on a pin. So we go up and we actually do this close-up page. We do closeup.preload on the home page, which is great. All right, so on to our last section, the review section. So this one is really, really important and beginning to be more important in the community as well. There's this idea of being ambushed by your JavaScript, and this GIF is so good. I just want to take a second and watch it. It made me so happy. It's one of those, the small things make me happy. That made me really happy. Yeah, so being ambushed by your JavaScript. So the idea here is that, sorry, should I go back? I think that was like making everyone really happy. Whatever tools your team chooses, a budget is essential. Without one, even the most advanced lightweight frameworks can easily create bloated, unusable apps. So this idea of a budget is becoming increasingly more important to people because they're realizing that it doesn't matter how good it is when you start. If this thing's going to live for 5 years, it's going to continue to grow and grow unless you have some kind of budget set. It's going to be bad in a year. And we felt the same thing at Pinterest. So we made sure that we built in support for a lot of things for performance and set budgets for ourselves. So here, I'm going to go through a couple examples of things that we've done at Pinterest to kind of set budgets for ourselves for performance. This first one is a graph of what we call PWT, which is pinner wait time. It's a composite metric, kind of like time to interactive, but also includes loading of some images that we think are important on the page. And so this one is going from the home feed to the close-up. Right, I said that was really fast because we normalized that data. Here's the proof that it's fast. It takes about 0.3 seconds to get from home feed to close-up because we already have the data, so it can be really, really fast. Now, we have this graph, and we noticed we got alerted of a big regression back in July. But because we had this data and we had the graph, it made it really easy to fix and identify. But if you don't have the data, then you can't do that. And I think that's one of the really important things is you have to find out what data is important and figure out ways to get those metrics kind of available to you in some form. Another awesome thing that we have at Pinterest is we are very data-driven, and we have a lot of experiments that get run. There's thousands of experiments out at any given time. And in our in-house experiment dashboard, we've actually got a performance banner at the top, which says what the effect of your experiment is on performance. So you could have some awesome feature that raises weekly active users or something a bunch, but if you're going to tank our performance metrics, we're just not going to let you do it. We're going to make you go in and figure out what the performance issue is, fix that first, and then you can land your experiment, which has been really, really fantastic. Also, we have stats for all of our bundles. So this is our mobile web bundles here. You can see that there was a slight regression here just a couple weeks ago. We actually knew about that one, so when it told us, we were okay with it. It's temporary. It's an experiment. So what we did is we created a Webpack plugin that essentially says when the compiler is done creating all of our JavaScript bundles, go through each of them and send out the information into our in-house database. So it's actually a really simple plugin, but it's been really helpful to be able to kind of view and set those budgets. So we've got budgets, and we get alerts anytime things go above the budget, which is great. Lastly, if you're not familiar with Lighthouse, Lighthouse is an auditing tool that Google's built. It's actually built into the Chrome developer tools now in the Audits tab. You should definitely check it out. It's very easy to use and gives you a lot of really, really good information. If there's nothing else you take away from this talk, you should go run Lighthouse against your site and see how it does. It'll give you a lot of good ideas of what things you can focus on. There's a great quote from John F. Kennedy. It says, "Forgive your enemies, but never forget their names." And I think that happens a lot with performance, where we fix things, and then we forget about it, because it's fixed, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. Right? So the idea is, behind this review audit step, this budgeting, is don't forget about it. Fix it, and then make sure it's not going to happen again. Or if it does regress, that you're aware of it. All right, so here's a quick little demo on a very slow 3G network of Pinterest's PWA. And you can see that it loads very quickly. So these are all like the 10 steps that go through here. You'll see, it'll wrap back around in a second. You'll see the app shell pop up there. And then we go to the home page. And we preloaded the close-up bundle, so that when I click on it here, it actually loads really, really fast. I get to reuse that pin data. I noticed it was an AMP page because it had that little lightning bolt there, and we have an AMP viewer in our PWA, so you don't actually have to leave the site. It looks like a native app, pops that thing up, which is really cool. I think it's so cool. I want to watch it again. So this thing, it feels such like a native app, right? And like that's the whole idea behind these PWAs, is how do you create something in the browser that feels like a native app? And something like that, like a little AMP viewer that pops up, like that feels like a native app, which is great. All right, so those are our 3 R's. Let's move on to the metrics as we finish up here. So first off, let's look at the performance metrics before and after. So previously, the time to first paint was at 4 seconds. Right, we know that server rendering takes longer, and the app shell is a lot faster. The time to interactive changed a lot. It went from 23 seconds to 5.6 seconds. That means that until 23 seconds passed, nobody could do anything on Pinterest previously, which is insane. That's one of the big benefits of app shells. It's a lot faster. The bundle size went from 620 to 150. So 620 is still where our desktop site sits at. Previously, they were sharing code, and now they're not. I guess that's changed. It's like 200 now. The CSS bundle size went from 150 to now we don't even have a CSS bundle. Now it's just inlined in the app shell. There was also a, well, this thing's freaking out. So there was a bunch of really good graphs that we saw as we moved forward with this project and shipped it. And some ridiculous GIFs again. This was our signups here, which was awesome. And drum roll, the final mobile web metric changes year over year. Weekly active users increased by 100%. In India, it increased by over 300%. The number of pins people saw, over 400%. And that's how Pinterest makes money, is how many pins you see, because some of those are ads. The number of pins saved was about 300%. The number of signups increased by 843% year over year on mobile web. We shipped in February, so like midway through February, and since March, it's been our #1 sign-up platform at Pinterest. More than Android, iOS, or desktop web. It's our #1 sign-up platform by a very significant amount. An interesting note as well is that we have about 800,000 PWA users as well. So these are weekly active users who have this thing on their home screen. So they have Pinterest PWA installed on their home screen, and they're using it weekly, which was actually kind of surprising to me. I didn't know how many people were actually doing that yet. And of course, when you get metrics like this, you're sitting there rolling in the money, so we felt very good. So as we review, these were the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, review. And I do want to say that it's worth it. So take some time, make your site better on mobile web, make a real PWA, and take the time to do it right, because it makes a big difference. Here's some bonus links if you're interested. I will put these slides up online. And thank you very much.
Now, we did get some interesting questions, if I may. Number 1, super technical. What about service workers on Safari?
What about service workers on Safari?
Now, just hang on a second. I have to tell you something. This is the coolest thing in the world. If 10 years ago you'd said, what about service workers on Safari? I would have said, I know what each of those words mean. But here it is, 2018. What about service workers on Safari?
Yeah. So it's only been I think 6 months maybe now that service workers have been released on Safari. And that was kind of a big achievement in itself, which has been great. They don't really have a whole lot of reason to invest in mobile web when all of their money comes from native apps. So it was actually pretty surprising and pretty great for the users that they were willing to do that. Yeah, so it's still very much a work in progress and nowhere close to the state that it is in Chrome right now.
All right. And one last one that somebody asked me the other night, actually. Why fork the mobile app instead of making a responsive website?
That's a great question. It's actually very timely too, because Twitter just announced that they're taking their mobile web PWA and shipping it back up to desktop. So they're reversing it. So they forked, and now they're unforking back the other direction, which is kind of interesting. So the reason that we did it was really that we wanted to do it right. So our desktop, all of the dependencies in our desktop web are very, very tightly knit together. And it's going to be like a very, very hard effort to kind of decouple all of those things. So if we wanted to get below 200K for our JavaScript bundle size, there was almost no way that we were going to do it in that same code base. So that and the interactions and feel of a mobile experience are very, very different from a desktop site. Right? Like even if you just think about touch versus mouse, that's a very, very different feel. And we wanted to make sure that it was optimized for your hands. And so everything, if you pull it up and you go check out the mobile web PWA for Pinterest, like all of your touches feel a certain way. Like you touch a pin and it slightly compresses and it feels like you actually touched it. And we wanted to be able to optimize for the mobile.
Fantastic. Everybody, what do you think of Zack's talk?
Thank you.